There are some things in this world that cannot be bought. Some legacies run too deep in the soil to be paved over by greed. Elias Thorne learned that truth on a mountain where his grandfather had planted roots a century ago. He had left war behind, seeking only silence and the companionship of a loyal dog named Atlas. But when men in expensive suits arrived with contracts and threats, when the law itself was twisted into a weapon against the innocent, Elias understood that some battles don't end overseas. Some battles come home, and some men never stop being warriors. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The mountain had no name on any map that mattered. It rose silent and ancient from the Appalachian spine, cloaked in oak and pine, wrapped in morning mists that clung to the ridges like ghosts reluctant to leave. At its base, tucked into a valley where a creek ran cold and clear over smooth stone, sat a farmhouse built in 1924 by hands that knew labor and sacrifice. The wood had weathered to silver gray. The porch sagged slightly on the eastern corner. The stone chimney still stood straight, mortared with care by a man who believed what he built should outlast him. Elias Thorne stood on that porch now, coffee steaming in a chipped mug, watching the sun break over the ridgeline. He was 43 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of a much older man. Scars traced pale lines across his knuckles and forearms, the kind earned in places where men fought without cameras or glory. His hair, dark and cropped short, had begun to silver at the temples. His frame was lean and hard, built not in a gym, but in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Iraq, the forgotten corners of the world where silence was survival. Beside him, motionless as stone, sat Atlas. The German shepherd's coat was dark sable, black bleeding into deep brown, his eyes amber and alert. He weighed 90 pounds of muscle and instinct, trained not for show, but for war. Atlas had been Elias's partner for 6 years overseas, tracking insurgents through rubble, detecting explosives hidden in market stalls, guarding sleeping men in forward operating bases where the darkness pressed close and deadly. When Elias left the Navy, Atlas came with him. They had bled together. They had survived together. Now they sought only peace together. The farm had belonged to Elias's grandfather, Samuel Thorne, a man who had worked this land for 78 years before his heart gave out the previous winter. He had left the property to Elias in a will written in careful, shaking handwriting. For the boy who understands that some things are worth defending. Elias had come home to bury him. He had stayed because there was nowhere else that felt like ground he could stand on. The first month had been quiet. He repaired fences, cleared brush, split firewood until his hands blistered and healed and blistered again. Atlas ranged the property, relearning scents that were wild and free, not soaked in blood and cordite. At night they sat on the porch, listening to the owl's call and the wind move through the pines. It was the kind of silence that healed, the kind that let a man sleep without jerking awake at every sound. Then the surveyors arrived. They came in white trucks with corporate logos printed on the doors, Greystone Development Corporation, 3 men in hard hats and high-visibility vests, carrying tablets and laser rangefinders, walking his property line like they owned it. Elias watched them from the barn, Atlas standing rigid at his side, ears forward. One of the men noticed him and waved, casual and condescending, as if Elias were a curious local rather than the landowner. Just doing some preliminary assessments, the man called out. New highway project. Exciting stuff. Elias said nothing. Atlas growled low, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest. The surveyors left before noon, but they returned the next day, and the day after that. On the fourth day, a black sedan arrived, polished and gleaming, out of place on the gravel road. A man stepped out, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, with a kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He walked up to the porch where Elias was replacing a rotted board. "Mr. Thorne?" the man said, extending a hand. "My name is Victor Carrington. I'm the Regional Director for Greystone Development." Elias glanced at the hand, but didn't take it. He set down his hammer and stood, wiping sawdust from his jeans. Atlas moved between them, silent, watching. Victor withdrew his hand smoothly, unbothered. "I'll get straight to the point. We're building a highway corridor through this region. It's going to bring jobs, economic growth, real progress to these mountains. Your property sits right in the planned route." "Not interested," Elias said. Victor's smile widened. "I understand attachment to land, Mr. Thorne. I really do. But we're prepared to offer you fair market value. More than fair, actually." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. $3 million. Elias didn't look at the paper. "Not for sale." 3.5. "No." Victor's smile thinned, just slightly. "Mr. Thorne, I respect your sentiment, but this project has federal and state backing. Eminent domain is a real thing. We're trying to do this the easy way, the respectful way, but the highway is happening, with or without your cooperation." Elias met his eyes, and for a moment, Victor saw something there that made him take an involuntary step back, something cold and patient and utterly without fear. "Get off my land," Elias said quietly. Victor stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll be in touch." He left, and the black sedan disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust. Atlas watched until the car was gone, then looked up at Elias, waiting. "Yeah, boy," Elias said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "I know. If you believe that courage still exists in quiet places, hit that like button and stand with those who refuse to be moved." The next 2 weeks brought a slow, creeping escalation, the kind Elias recognized from deployments where the enemy tested defenses before committing to an assault. The surveyors returned, but now they brought security, private contractors in black polo shirts and tactical pants, armed with sidearms they barely tried to conceal. They walked the fence line, taking photos, marking stakes in the ground with neon pink flags. When Elias approached, they ignored him, turning their backs with calculated disrespect. He didn't engage, not yet. Then the water in the well turned foul. Elias noticed it first in the morning when he filled Atlas's bowl. The water smelled of chemicals, a sharp, acrid tang that made his eyes water. He dumped it immediately, tested the well himself. Someone had dumped industrial solvent down the shaft. Not enough to kill, but enough to make the water undrinkable. He switched to bottled water, but the message was clear. We can reach you. We can hurt you. 2 nights later, he woke to the sound of fence wire snapping. Atlas was already on his feet, a low growl rumbling. Elias pulled on boots and a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and followed the dog into the darkness. They found the southern fence line cut in 3 places, posts knocked over, barbed wire tangled in the grass. Tire tracks marked the mud, a heavy truck, industrial tread. Elias crouched, shining his light on the ground. Atlas circled, nose working, reading the story written in scent and soil. 4 men, diesel fuel, cigarette smoke, fear sweat. Elias stood, scanning the tree line. He didn't see them, but he knew they were watching, waiting for him to panic, to call the sheriff, to do anything that would give them leverage. Instead, he went back to the barn, pulled out a toolbox, and spent the next 3 hours repairing the fence by lamplight. Atlas sat guard, ears rotating like radar dishes, tracking every rustle of wind, every shift of shadow. When the sun rose, the fence was whole again. The following afternoon, Elias drove into town, a place called Ridgemont that barely qualified as a dot on a map. One main street, a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a sheriff's station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Sheriff Dale Hutchins was a man in his 60s, overweight and weary, sitting behind a desk piled with paperwork and fast food wrappers. He looked up when Elias walked in, and his expression shifted to something between annoyance and resignation. "Mr. Thorne," Hutchins said, "I heard you might be stopping by." "Someone poisoned my well," Elias said. "Cut my fences, trespassed on my property." Hutchins sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You got proof?" "Tire tracks, chemical residue, witnesses." "Witnesses?" "My dog." Hutchins didn't smile. "Look, son, I understand you're upset, but Greystone Development is a major investor in this county. They've funded new school programs, road repairs, emergency services. They're bringing jobs here. They're breaking the law. Progress is messy sometimes," Hutchins said. "My advice? Take their offer. It's generous. More money than you'd see in a lifetime of farming." Elias stared at him, and Hutchins shifted uncomfortably. "You've been paid off," Elias said quietly. Hutchins' face flushed red. "Watch your mouth, boy." "How much did they give you? New patrol car? Campaign donations?" Hutchins stood, jabbing a finger toward the door. "Get out. You come back here throwing accusations, I'll arrest you for harassment." Elias didn't move for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Understood." He walked out, Atlas at his side, and climbed into his truck. As he drove back up the mountain, he felt the old familiar weight settling onto his shoulders, the weight of knowing that the law would not help him, that justice would have to be earned the hard way. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, watching him, and Elias reached over, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Looks like it's just you and me, boy," he said, "like old times. If you believe those who stand for what's right should never stand alone, leave a comment about what you would fight to protect." Elias had learned a long time ago that defense was not passive. In Afghanistan, they called it area denial, making your position so dangerous, so costly to approach, that the enemy chose to go elsewhere. He had 200 acres, a dog trained for war, and 20 years of tactical experience. It was time to make Greystone Development regret ever hearing the name Thorne. He started with reconnaissance. For 3 nights, Elias and Atlas moved through the property in darkness, silent as smoke, mapping every trail, every blind spot, every place where an intruder might approach. Atlas ranged ahead, reading the wind, cataloging scents. On the second night, the dog froze near the eastern tree line, hackles raised. Elias crouched, scanning with night vision optics he'd kept from his service days. There, hidden in the brush 30 meters out, was a trail camera, the kind hunters used, but this one was pointed at his house. He left it in place, better to know where they were watching. By the fourth night, Atlas had found 3 more cameras, all positioned to cover approach routes and the main house. Elias marked their locations mentally, but didn't disturb them. Let Greystone think they were unseen. Let them believe they had the advantage. On the 5th night, he went on offense. The first trap was simple. A pressure-activated floodlight rigged near the southern fence, where they'd cut before, paired with a motion-sensing alarm that fed directly to his phone. The second was more elegant, a tripwire connected to a paint bomb filled with indelible purple dye, hidden along the path leading from the road to the barn. The third was psychological, a series of wooden stakes driven into the ground in a perimeter around the house, each one carved with a single word in block letters: "Turn back." He wasn't trying to kill anyone. He was sending a message: "You are not safe here. You are being hunted." The message was received faster than he expected. 2 nights later, at 2:47 a.m., his phone buzzed. The southern perimeter alarm. Elias was awake instantly, pulling on black tactical pants and a dark jacket. Atlas was already by the door, ears forward, body coiled. They moved out together, Elias carrying a suppressed .45 and a handheld spotlight. He didn't run. Running made noise. He flowed through the darkness, using the terrain, the trees, the shadows. The floodlight near the southern fence blazed white, and Elias heard shouting, panicked, angry. He circled wide, coming up behind the light, and found 2 men stumbling in the glare, both covered head to toe in dripping purple paint. They were cursing, slipping in the mud, trying to wipe dye from their eyes. Atlas growled, low and steady, and both men froze, spinning toward the sound. Elias stepped into the light, calm and unhurried, his sidearm held low and ready. "You're trespassing," he said. One of the men, younger, maybe 30, started to reach for something at his waist, a radio, maybe a weapon. Atlas exploded forward with a snarl that sounded like tearing metal, covering the distance in 3 bounding strides. The man fell backward with a scream, hands up, and Atlas stood over him, teeth bared, waiting for the command to bite. "Don't," Elias said to the other man, who had started to move. "He's faster than you, and he doesn't miss." The second man froze, hands raised. Elias pulled zip ties from his jacket and tossed them at the younger man's feet. "Secure your buddy's hands behind his back, then your own." "You can't." "I can. You're on my property. I have every right to detain you until the sheriff arrives. Or would you prefer I let the dog decide?" They complied, fumbling with the zip ties, purple dye dripping onto the ground. When they were secure, Elias took their wallets, their phones, their radios. He photographed their faces, their IDs, their contractor badges, Sentinel Security Solutions, contracted to Greystone Development. "Tell your boss," Elias said quietly, "that this is my land. Tell him that every man he sends, I will send back. Tell him that I am not afraid, and I am not for sale." He cut them loose, kept their equipment, and watched them stumble down the mountain road, covered in paint, humiliated and defeated. Atlas sat beside him, panting lightly, eyes gleaming in the floodlight. "Good boy," Elias said, and the dog's tail thumped once. The next morning, Elias found another gift, a dead crow nailed to his porch railing, a crude threat meant to intimidate. He buried the bird, said a quiet prayer, and went back to work. If you feel the tension rising and need to see how this ends, drop a comment and stay with us. They came again 4 nights later, but this time they were smarter. No vehicles, no radios, no lights. 6 men, moving in coordinated formation through the woods, using military hand signals, night vision optics, suppressed weapons. These weren't security contractors. These were mercenaries. Atlas woke Elias at 3:12 a.m., not with a bark, but with a low, continuous growl that meant danger close. Elias was dressed and armed in under 30 seconds, moving to the window, scanning the darkness. He saw nothing, but Atlas's ears were locked on the northwestern tree line. Elias activated the perimeter cameras he'd installed, military surplus, thermal imaging, and watched the screens. 6 heat signatures advancing in a staggered line, covering each other's movement. Professional, deadly. His heart rate didn't spike. His breathing stayed even. This was familiar ground. He keyed his radio, one he'd rigged to override their frequency, and spoke calmly into the mic. "You're surrounded, you're outnumbered, and you're outmatched. Leave now, or I stop being polite." The figures froze. Confused radio chatter crackled. They hadn't expected to be detected, let alone spoken to. Elias didn't wait. He triggered the first countermeasure, a series of air horns rigged throughout the woods, each one blaring at 120 decibels, shattering the silence, destroying their night vision, disorienting them. Then he released Atlas. The German shepherd vanished into the darkness like a shadow given teeth. Elias followed, moving parallel, using the chaos. He heard the first man scream, not in pain, but in terror, as 90 pounds of snarling fury hit him from behind, dragging him to the ground. Atlas didn't bite to injure. He bit to control, clamping onto the man's forearm, holding him immobile. Elias zip-tied him in under 10 seconds, then whistled Atlas off. The dog melted back into the woods. The remaining 5 men panicked. One fired blindly into the trees, the suppressed shot barely louder than a cough. Elias didn't return fire. Instead, he triggered the second countermeasure, a tripwire net that snapped up from the forest floor, tangling 2 more men in reinforced nylon cord. 4 down, 2 running. Elias pursued, silent and relentless, Atlas ranging ahead. They cornered the last 2 near the creek, where the water ran cold and fast over slick stones. The men spun, weapons raised, but Atlas was already moving, hitting the first man low, taking out his knee. The man went down hard, his weapon skittering into the water. The last man dropped his gun, hands raised, breathing hard. "I give up," he gasped. "I give up!" Elias stepped into view, his .45 trained center mass. "Who sent you?" "Carrington. Victor Carrington." "What were your orders?" "Scare you. Burn the house if we had to. Make you leave." Elias stared at him for a long moment, then lowered his weapon. "Go," he said. "Take your friends. Tell Carrington that if he sends anyone else, they won't walk away." The man nodded frantically, helped his companions to their feet, and they disappeared into the darkness, limping and terrified. Atlas returned to Elias's side, panting, eyes bright. "Good work, boy," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good work." But as he walked back to the house, he knew the truth. Carrington wasn't going to stop. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about pride. And men like Carrington would rather burn the world than admit defeat. If this moment shook you, share your reaction below and let us know you're still here. Victor Carrington arrived at midnight, alone. Elias watched from the porch as the black sedan rolled up the gravel drive, headlights cutting through the darkness. The engine shut off. The door opened. Carrington stepped out, wearing a long coat, his silver hair gleaming in the moonlight. He walked toward the porch slowly, hands visible, no weapon. Atlas stood at Elias's side, silent, watching. "Mr. Thorne," Carrington called out, "I think it's time we talked, just you and me." Elias didn't answer. Carrington stopped 10 feet from the porch steps. "You've cost me a lot of money, embarrassed a lot of people, but I respect you. You're a fighter. So let me make you an offer you can actually consider." "Not interested." $5 million. Cash. You sign the deed tonight, you're gone by morning, and you never have to think about this place again. You can buy land anywhere, start over, live like a king. Elias shook his head slowly. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Carrington said, his voice hardening. "Explain why you'd rather die on this worthless rock than live rich somewhere else." Elias stood, stepping to the edge of the porch. Atlas moved with him, a shadow of muscle and fang. "This land," Elias said quietly, "was built by my grandfather's hands. He planted every fence post. He dug that well. He carried stones from the creek to build that chimney. He raised my father here. My father raised me here. It's not about money. It's about legacy. It's about knowing that some things are worth more than what you can spend." Carrington stared at him, and for the first time, his smile was gone. "You're a fool," he said. "Maybe," Elias replied, "but I'm a fool who's still standing." Carrington's expression twisted. "You think you've won? You think this is over? I own the sheriff. I own the county commissioners. I own the judge who'll sign the eminent domain order. You can't fight the system, Thorne. The system always wins." Elias smiled then, a cold, quiet smile. "You're right," he said. "I can't fight the system, but I don't have to." He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and held it up. "See, while your mercenaries were stumbling around my woods, Atlas found something interesting. Surveillance bugs, recording devices, hidden in my barn, my house, even my truck. All of them stamped with your company's serial numbers." Carrington's face went pale. "And while I was zip-tying your hired thugs, I made copies of their phones, texts, emails, orders, all of it traced back to you. Illegal surveillance, criminal trespass, conspiracy to commit arson, attempted intimidation of a protected veteran." Elias stepped down from the porch, and Atlas moved with him, low and menacing. "I've already sent copies to the governor's office, the FBI, and a journalist friend who specializes in corporate corruption. By morning, every news station in the state will be running your name." Carrington's hands clenched into fists. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" For a long moment the two men stared at each other, predator and prey, and it was Carrington who looked away first. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking. "Yes," Elias said quietly. "It is." Carrington turned and walked back to his car. He climbed in, started the engine, and drove away, taillights disappearing into the night. Elias stood in the silence. Atlas pressed against his leg, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. If this story deserves to be heard by those who still believe in standing your ground, share it now and let the truth spread. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 72 hours, federal agents arrived at Greystone Development's regional headquarters with warrants. By the end of the week, Victor Carrington was facing 15 felony charges. The highway project was suspended pending review. The governor issued a public statement condemning corporate overreach and promising reforms to eminent domain laws. Sheriff Dale Hutchins resigned quietly, accepting a plea deal in exchange for testimony. And the farm remained. Elias stood on the porch one morning, 2 months later, watching the sun rise over the ridgeline. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Atlas lay beside him, gray beginning to show around his muzzle, but his eyes still sharp, still watchful. A truck rolled up the drive, and Elias recognized the driver, a journalist from the state capitol, a woman named Claire Dawson, who had broken the Greystone story nationwide. She stepped out, smiling. "Mr. Thorne, I wanted to thank you in person." "For what?" Elias asked. "For reminding people that some things can't be bought. Your stories inspired dozens of families to fight back against eminent domain abuse. The state legislature is drafting new protections. You've made a real difference." Elias nodded slowly. "I just wanted to keep my home." "And you did," Claire said. "That's everything." She left, and Elias sat back down, Atlas's head resting on his knee. He thought about his grandfather, about the hands that had built this place, about the legacy that had been entrusted to him. He thought about the men he'd served with overseas, the ones who hadn't made it home, the ones who had fought for something larger than themselves. And he understood finally that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. Peace was knowing what you stood for and refusing to be moved. The mountains were silent. The creek ran cold and clear. The farmhouse stood strong. And Elias Thorne was home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that faith still lives in ordinary days. Leave a comment about the blessings you've witnessed in your own life. And subscribe for more stories that remind us we are never too lost to be found again. May God bless you, keep you warm in your winters, and fill your home with the quiet, steady light of hope.